Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 66. Throws chapter into pit of angry ravenous dogs. He couldn't stay here. The location was compromised. Eraser knew where it was, and more importantly, someone had come poking around close enough for DJ to try and scare them off. It wasn't safe anymore. It wasn't home anymore, not without her. The thought of leaving hurt just as much as the thought of staying here and waking up every morning alone. No, he couldn't stay here. Through tear-filled eyes, he started stuffing his nest into his duffel bag. He already used his suitcase as a dresser of sorts, so he just stuffed as much stuff in there as he could, along with his clothes. He packed all the essentials. He could come back for the rest later. He threaded the handles of the duffel bag around the handle of his suitcase and dragged them up the stairs. He couldn't help but remember the first time he did this, packed up his life and left. He was so scared then. He wouldn't even walk through uptown with his stuff for fear that someone would take it. He'd like to see someone try and take his shit now. With determination, he stalked toward the old brewery he taught himself how to free run in, while keeping an eye out to make sure no one followed. The brewery was closer to all the commotion on Block 8, but he didn't care. No, he didn't care one bit. If he was going to keep living, then he was going to make them pay. Whoever was stalking around over by his warehouse must be involved with the gang. They were looking for him. This wasn't a coincidence. He might not be able to find out exactly who did this, but that wouldn't matter if he burned their entire operation to the ground. Perhaps literally. He hadn't decided yet. He spent the rest of the day going back and forth between the two warehouses, lugging all his crap. He didn't have anywhere to set up yet in the brewery, but he's sure he could find somewhere. He could explore later. Right now, he needed something mindless, something to keep the blood rushing through his veins and distract him from his head. On his last trip to the old warehouse, he looked over everything. All that was left were some scrap parts from the lower landing, his dirty laundry, and the stuffed cat plush. He shoved the clothes and scraps into his bag and looked down at the plush lying at his feet. He stood there for a moment before he walked away. He trudged up the stairs and didn't let himself look back. He kept his eyes trained forward until the building was well out of sight. Shota had been on edge all day. He'll admit that he'd been completely insufferable until 11:38, when Ivy finally texted him back. He hardly spoke a word to anyone, and he'd just given his classes busy work or study halls because he knew he wouldn't be able to give a coherent lecture. So they'd all be better off if he just didn't even try. He contemplated just not coming in at all, but he barely got a wink of sleep, and by the time the alarm sounded, he was damn near tearing his hair out. He needed some sort of distraction. Hizashi was a damn saint through it all. They let him communicate through vague grunts, pointed looks, and one-word sentences without complaint. They made him coffee twice before they even left the house, and he's sure they texted Nem and either explained the situation or told her not to prod him because everyone, blessedly, left him alone. He spent his lunch with Zashi and didn't bother trying to stomach anything but a nutrient pouch. He just sat there and stared at his phone sitting on his desk and waited. If they didn't respond by noon, he was going to take the latter half of the day off to go check on them, and with every minute that ticked down, he got more and more tense. Zashi was half-heartedly poking at their own lunch next to him, with one hand rested on his thigh under the table. He was running his thumb back and forth at a steady pace, and that might have been the only thing keeping him sane. When his screen finally lit up with a notification, they both shot up in their seats as Shota snatched the phone off the table. It was Ivy. Thank Hummy, it was Ivy. Hizashi read the text over his shoulder as he typed out a quick thank you back to them. He sunk back into his chair and took a deep breath or two. That awful weight of not knowing was lifted off his shoulders, but he was still worried. He didn't think he was ever going to stop worrying about this kid. Shota was sitting on the ledge waiting for Ivy like he did nearly every day, but unlike every other day, anxiety was roiling in his gut. He needed to calm down. They'd texted him this morning. They were okay. Well, probably not okay, but they were alive. Seconds stretched into eternities until he heard them crest over the ledge on the other side of the roof. He had to stop himself from whipping around and running over to them. They were going through a lot. They didn't need to deal with his erratic behavior on top of it. He turned around calmly, like he would any other night, and looked at them. They didn't look any different. He didn't know why he expected them to. They seemed hesitant, which made sense, so he stood up and walked over to them. He was the actual adult here. He could do this. "Hey, kid," he greeted. Ivy looked down at their shoes before answering, "Hey." They just stood looking at each other for a few awkward moments before Shota spoke. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I know what you're going through, because I don't. But He trailed off for a moment. What he went through after losing Oboro was never easy to talk about, and after almost losing Ivy, it certainly wasn't any easier. I've been that low before. I know that He cut himself off again and closed his eyes for a moment to collect himself. I know how difficult it can be to find a reason to keep going, and I don't know what you have in terms of friends or family, but you have me, and I would be devastated if he was barely keeping his composure at this point. Kami, why was it just so hard to just speak? I would be devastated if I lost you, Ivy. So if you have nothing else, then do it for me, please. I'm not good with all of this. He gestured vaguely between the two of them, but I can listen. I can try. He finally concluded. He could see tears starting to brim in their eyes as they let out a humorless laugh. How can you say that when you don't know the first damn thing about me, Eraser? That's not true, kid, he argued. They just looked at him, then looked back to the ground, shaking their head. They clearly didn't believe him. I might not know pedantic trivia about you. I might not know your name or your face, but I know your heart, Ivy. I know you, even if I don't, even if this was all some elaborate ruse and every word you've ever said was a lie, I still know that I would miss you. Can't that be enough?" The tears threatening to spill from their eyes finally fell down their cheeks, and he reached out on instinct before he stopped himself, but they didn't flinch away. Their eyes shifted focus to his hand, but they didn't flinch from him. Slowly, he moved closer, and they still didn't back away, so he pulled them against his chest. They were so small, but it was a balm to his soul to feel them breathing, warm and alive, and breathing. He wrapped his arms around their bony shoulders and held them tight. He felt their breath shudder as they cried into his chest and clutched at the back of his jumpsuit. They were safe. They were here. They were going to be okay. He held them until they stopped crying, and they pulled away. They stepped back and steadfastly refused to look him in the eye, so he just gave them a moment. I'm sorry, they finally croaked out. "Kid, don't." They cut him off. "No, I am just for all of it. I'm sorry, they said as they finally looked at him. The makeup around their eyes had smudged off a bit, and either there were specks of it still left behind, or they had a spattering of freckles across their cheeks. He couldn't really tell with the sun setting behind them. You don't have to apologize, he tried, but Ivy wasn't having it. Well, I am, they said with finality. Fine, then I forgive you, he countered. They dropped their gaze after that, unable to look him in the eye any longer. Ivy, he asked to get their attention back. They let out a hum and glanced up at him for a brief moment in acknowledgement. He started and then trailed off, not quite sure how to phrase what he needed to ask. After a moment of silence, he decided, screw it, this conversation didn't need to be a game of chess. Ivy, how old are you? He asked. They looked back up at him purely out of shock before answering, Eraser, you know I'm not gonna give you identifying information. He knew that would be the answer, but he pressed on regardless. Kid, you're living in a stairwell, and I heard you last night. You don't sound old enough to be on your own, and you don't even come up to my shoulder. They scrunched their brow up at the comment on their height, but he continued regardless. I'm not trying to say you're incapable. I'm just worried, he admitted. I don't live in the stairwell, they countered. Ivy, there was a cat door cut out. I don't live there anymore. I I used to. I've got four walls and a roof. I've got heat, electricity, and access to clean water, and I can take care of myself. I know you probably will anyway, but you don't need to worry about me, they said, forcing themselves to meet his eyes. I know I sound young. That's why I made this. They gestured to their voice modulator. No one ever took me seriously, but I assure you, I am old enough to take care of myself. Shoto really wanted to believe all that. If Ivy was lying, they didn't give any tells, but still, something didn't sit right with him. I want to believe that, kid, but I don't. I'm not lying to you. I I swear on DJ's grave, they said as a few more tears fell from their eyes. Cross my heart and hope to die, they added with a humorless laugh. He was so shocked that he couldn't help the scoff that left his mouth. He lifted a hand up to scrub at the scruff of his face. Don't say that, Ivy, he mumbled into his hand. He really wanted to believe them. He was generally pretty good at telling whether or not someone was lying, and they didn't sound like they were lying. Kami, where's Tsukashi when you need him? He looked up and studied their face again. They looked genuine, granted. He couldn't see over half their face, but he had grown accustomed to dealing with that by now. What could he do if they were lying anyway? Take them in? He couldn't do that. That wouldn't end well for literally anyone. He'd been over that scenario in his mind 1,000 times over. It simply wasn't an option, and forcing the subject any more than he already had wasn't going to get him anywhere, so he let it drop. All he could do was be there for him. All right, okay. He paused for a moment before adding, if you ever find yourself on the streets again, tell me, please. If you ever need anything at all, just tell me, okay? I've got a guest room if you need somewhere to crash. I've got 2 full-time jobs. I can spare the funds if you need food or anything. Just tell me, please, he pleaded. Ivy's gaze dropped again at the offer, and they just nodded. I don't care if you think it's stupid. I don't care what you need or want, and I don't care when. I'm not gonna lose you, Ivy, he asserted. They simply nodded again. Do you have someone, kid? Someone to talk to? He pushed cautiously. It was a little too personal, a little too probing, but he needed to know. Yeah, Eraser. I've got someone. Don't think I could get rid of them if I tried. Think I'd have to kill 'em myself, they said with a rueful laugh. Good. You need someone like that, he replied. He felt better knowing they had someone. It didn't matter who they were to them, as long as it was someone. All right, that's enough of that shit, he declared. Let's talk about those knife skills. I think you gave me a haircut last night. You think you ready to take them on patrols now? End of chapter.